Good luck, Len.
Thank you. So I'm not sure if the quorum is set. MEV. Okay, I'll start by introducing myself if the quorum is good to go.
Yeah.
My name is Len Koskei Chelimo. I'm a Kenyan. My nationality, I'm an advocate of the High Court of Kenya, my profession. I'm a co-founder of Flamingo Chap Chap, which had the privilege also to host this event today. I was told to introduce myself in 20 words. I think that will be all for now. I'm eagerly and looking forward for the meeting to go as planned. At this juncture, I'll introduce our co-guest, Professor Patrick Bond. Maybe can tell us 1 or 3 in 50 words about himself. Thank you.
I can, and I hope everyone can hear. In Johannesburg, South Africa, I'm at the second oldest university. It's called University of Johannesburg. We're 20 years old. And I was at the other university, WITS, as well as universities in Durban and Cape Town. I studied environmental engineering, geography, and political economy at Johns Hopkins. And I've worked with the climate movements, including a Durban group for climate justice, the first time that this great phrase, climate justice, was used. And that was back in 2004. And it was the original critique of the privatization of the air, selling the right to pollute in carbon markets. So I'm really glad to have a chance to update, and especially Len, because so much of my work involves the dear allies we have in Nairobi, one of whom is in the house, Martha Bekele, one of our PhD students, who's Ethiopian but based in Nairobi. So Martha will help me if I misspeak, or we have a paper together which I'll share with you that's just about to be published about what happened in Baku last year. So thanks for having me. Should I just get going, Len?
We are struggling. Personally, I'm struggling to hear you, Prof.
Okay. How about others? Are others having any trouble?
Exactly. Others, the chat box, anyone?
I'm having no trouble from the Netherlands. I hear Patrick well.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you for
I can
that.
hear him as well.
And I have a little suggestion for everyone. If you have difficulty, put on your captions and turn it to English, and you can have, let's say, simultaneous stimuli, one for your ears and one for your eyes. The reading text is quite good in the captions there and helps you to follow.
Yeah, thank you for that. The captions are now clear from my end. I suppose everyone have also put on the captions.
Great. Well, in that case, allow me to begin. What I'm also just doing, I hope it's acceptable, is sending you some slides. I won't use all of these slides here. You see quite a few. But what I will do, if you can see the slide now, is quickly try to make some points about how the G20 becomes a site for very, very important struggles. And I am getting a little bit of signal that my internet isn't so strong at the moment, so I'm not too sure what to do with that, but let's just do our best. One of the reasons I want to dwell on this ideological problem, paleoconservatism, which is the climate denialism of the Trump regime and plenty of others. But there are particularly important moments, I think, in the few months we have before the G20, where we will learn how two blocks within the G20 are coming together. And I'll spend just a moment trying to give you a sense of the G20. Its two main characteristics are now being, let's say, violated by Donald Trump. And the reason is because His paleoconservatism partly reflects that the oil companies in the US gave him $1 billion. And this is the payback time, massive expansion of US fossil fuels, the complete destruction of the Environmental Protection Agency, and the walkout from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, especially the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties. And I'm just going to short this when I talk about it. We don't really say the Conference of the Parties and the UNFCCC, blah, blah, blah. We say the Conference of Polluters, just so it's short and clear what we mean. The Conference of the Polluters we hosted in Durban, South Africa in 2011, as I'll come back to. But we really have so little regard for what the UNFCCC is doing because there are two blocks, the G20 core, that is the West, and the BRICS. And those two blocks, the BRICS especially that we focus on, since South Africa was one of the 2010 members, well, it was a member in this sort of first expansion, having been the BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa added in 2010. And then here in Johannesburg, at the last BRIC summit here in 2023, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Iran were added, and the United Arab Emirates. But Indonesia actually only accepted in January this year, and Saudi Arabia didn't yet accept its invitation. And then there are also quite a few new partners, a dozen, which I'll just show you in a minute. We have a problem with the Trump climate denialism because it isn't just that the US is pulling away. In its role in the G20 and especially in its last gasp within the COP, it takes 4 years for them to get out. They are committed to sabotage. And that means that the Trump regime does join the rest of the, let's say, G7 imperial powers, the big imperialist, colonialist, sort of Western European elites, with Japan as well and Canada, in 3 ways. So let me quickly tell you the punchline, my summation of what's going to be happening. The first important thing for the G20 is to not cut corporate, state, and household emissions or leave fossil fuels in the soil underground to the extent that will be necessary to avoid unmanageable planetary disasters. The second key thing is that they will continue to refuse to pay and to acknowledge and to work on their climate debt. And the third thing is that they're committed to privatizing the air, which is, as I said, the privatization of the air is basically our phrase for commodifying the climate policies so that they basically allow the rich to buy on the carbon markets and offset schemes and trading schemes the right to continue emitting. So we'll go into the implications at the end because we want to go through why climate justice is a very different approach here in the G20 in Johannesburg. Even though we're very diverse, we have climate action, which is a different ideology. But I think for Africans who are in the House to sort of pay attention to who in your capital cities and how even in your small towns and your rural areas, your ability to shift the global debates are limited. I mean, so obviously our ability to protest is going to be highly constrained here in Johannesburg, not by repression, but by just putting us 4 kilometers away from the main convention center, where today the G20 is scheduled. It may change between now and then, but it's currently in the Sandton Convention Center. So the African Union is a member of the G20. We'd therefore love to have more of the voices from those of you in the room to get involved, to join us. We, I think, all recognize how the Trump regime is wrecking the environment. Some of you in Zambia may have noticed last week the Trump government said to all its employees, get out of the Kafue River because that area was dumped on by a Chinese company. That's sort of more geopolitics because, of course, the US is the main historic emitter and is now going full speed ahead. And then we're going to also see, it says December, that was, it used to be scheduled, but now it's been moved up to early November through the 21st. And the G20 begins here on the 22nd, 23rd of November. So that COP30 will also, I'm quite sure, reveal the ecocidal tendencies of the elites, including of the host government of Brazil, which you see grappling with a couple of things. One is legislation, but the other is the ability of Petrobras, their state oil company, to drill offshore not only the Amazon River, where it hits the Atlantic, but also here in South Africa on the Pacific coast, because Petrobras is allied with Total, the French company. So what we've got looks like this. Okay, this is a sort of joke from our great cartoonist. You'll see some more of his work, Sapiro. The G20 are emitting. They're like having a huge meal, of feast of baked beans, if you know what I mean. If you don't, you should find on YouTube Blazing Saddles. And there you see all of the G20 as major emitters. And there's only one African in the house at this point, South Africa, but now the AU has been added. So the G20 consists of all of these countries, because in a way you could take the EU with all its member states and the AU with all its member states. And so the huge chunk of the world is within this G20, but really it's the G7 needing to expand. And the expansion occurred in the 2008-9 financial crisis, because the G7, although it was called a G8 in 2014, they kicked out Russia. But at that point, they realized that they needed a global bailout of their banks. So they said, okay, well, let's bring in a G20. And they basically brought in the BRICS, the two big ones, although it's not quite a member yet. Saudi Arabia has been invited, and it has huge foreign reserves, and China. And those were the ones that George W. Bush wanted to have as G20 members in 2008-9, and it continued with the meetings once, sometimes twice a year. And in particular moments, especially for Africa, where the COVID crisis hit and they needed to do a bit of debt relief, which was really just a sort of extension of the debt for a few years. And there were, in those respects, in not just 2009, 10, 11, but also 2020, 21, coordinated expansion. And it took the form sometimes of the G20 members having enough resources to print money. As the US, Europe, and Japan and UK did, that's called quantitative easing, but also to run deficits during the periods of crisis, especially the meltdown of 2020, and of course the reason they came together, 2008, 9, 10, when there was a big financial crisis. But now this BRICS network has gotten a reputation. Certainly Donald Trump, on 11 separate occasions, has been fearful of the BRICS and its expansion. I'm fearful of the BRICS and its expansion for lots of good reasons. We can get into them, all the other ones, but today we focus on the expansion of the climate politics that I think are going to be catastrophic. Because even though they're less than 34% of GDP, that is gross domestic product, the output, the economic, sort of measurable output of goods and services, they're actually emitting 51% of the emissions. Now, let me switch to the ideologies before I review some of the climate implications of what's going to be happening here in Johannesburg. So the first of 6 distinct ideologies, climate denialism, has now made this incredible push through, thanks to Trump, first in 2016, and even before that, in July 2016, there was the Brexit vote, in which you kind of got a sense that the disgruntled lower middle class and working class, especially whites, especially men, would start voting against their own interests, really, by getting the likes of the British Tories or Donald Trump into power. And if you don't know any of these descriptions or names, I'm sure you will at some point, because they're making their way all around the world, particularly because a man called Steve Bannon is a very strong ideologue. So is Tucker Carlson, their sort of TV star. And I'd call it a kind of global ultra-right. It's evangelical Christian Zionist sometimes, meaning they support Israel's genocide of Palestine. They're Islamophobic. They have all of these characteristics, xenophobic and racist. And what we see mostly is their protectionism and their isolationism in the tariff wars. The second feature is of the power ideologies is a neoconservative tendency, which often goes against paleo-conservative. And Marco Rubio has been the key figure with Lindsey Graham, a US senator, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, and their main ideologue has been John Bolton. Trump has moved in this direction, especially in his tensions with Russia in the recent weeks, and his support for Israel and the bombing of Iran and all the rest. And they're warmongering, and I would say openly, genocidal. There's a nickname for the core of the neoconservative power bloc called the Blob. And they're just as happy as the paleocons with climate denialism, because a lot of the wars that they fought were over oil in the Middle East. The third power bloc is the neoliberal. And that's what we always see, don't we? In most African cities, we're being run by the IMF and World Bank. We're being run by our treasury and finance ministries and central banks, who are full of financiers in revolving doors. There's a new element to them where I think the Johannesburg schooled Elon Musk. He was really raised in Pretoria, but the 2 years he spent here in Johannesburg were crucial because he was a victim of extreme bullying, where he said he was nearly killed. So he became a monster here in Johannesburg. So we take huge, responsibility and make a big apology. And we say, well, we did give you Trevor Noah, the comedian, and we gave you Tyler, the singer. So, sorry, I know it's not enough to make up for draining Elon Musk here. But they're techno-feudalists in that group, right? Who want big control of not just the money, but the ideas, that data, your lives. And I think these are still, by and large, the ruling ideologies of the European Union countries, of the United Kingdom. You get it in the World Economic Forum in a sophisticated way. Now, I think another power block that we have to understand is not against the three above, they're within. And that's the BRICS. That's the multipolar. They're not really against a unipolar in the content, that is multilateral global capitalism. They're very tightly aligned with neoliberalism in their statements, but they would want a bigger piece of the pie. So you do see the BRICS making vague proposals for reforming international finance, and their work on climate, I'll show you in a moment, has some of the characteristics that they are joining. And then you see a very powerful intellectual network called Tricontinental, leaning largely in this multipolar direction. There are two more critical progressive traditions that are out of power, although you find little bits of their ideologies in the governments of Mexico and Colombia, Sri Lanka, a little bit, Senegal, less and less. And I think you still have the residues of three old white men who, in France, in the US, and in Britain, carry a social democratic ideologies on Luc Mélenchon, Bernie Sanders, and Jeremy Corbyn. And then I think everyone in the House would probably be comfortable if I put you into the sixth ideological orientation of progressive internationalism, with a commitment to, global justice, Black Lives Matter, feminism, the support of Palestine. No kings, as a slogan in the US has emerged against Trump, and of course, climate justice. So those are my six, let me call them, categories, where often the positions, obviously everyone's fluid and they're moving through these positions. And then if we look at the ways in which the emissions implicate the big economies, we have to do some corrections. And I don't have the full data for you right now and the most up-to-date data, but you just get a sense that the major emitters are actually the BRICS, and it's China, India, Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, the new BRIC this year, Saudi Arabia, and a potential BRIC. Iran is a BRIC. And then South Africa is down on that list as the main African emitter. And the changes, you'll see the BRICS are the fastest growing emitters, whereas in some cases, the US and the EU, Russia, if it's measured starting in 1990 because of the crash of the Soviet Union. But basically, we have major emissions and growing emissions from the BRICS. We can look at the domestic emissions from fossil fuels. And if you want to follow along and get the actual slides, I've sent them, you'll find them in the chat to download. The greenhouse gas emissions that are also scope 3, they're exported. And there you see some of the major BRICS again, Russia, but you see, of course, Australia, the US as well. Then we have the coal consumption, which is from, again, leading the most dirty energy source, China. India, third is the US, fourth Germany, fifth is Russia. Germany has, after its Russian boycott in 2022 and the oil and the gas that was, the US blew up, I think, that Nord Stream pipeline. So Germany did turn to more coal briefly, but they are apparently coming back down. We look at methane gas, which is, as you know, much worse than CO2, and the gas consumption led by the US by far, as well as exporting. And then daily oil, of course, US still number one. Coal-fired power plants, though, under construction, mostly in China and India. And then we would do one other thing that's important. We could go for per capita emissions. We could go per unit of economic output. But this is also important since we have a decolonial agenda, is to acknowledge that especially Russia with its Soviet Union and the UK with its colonial empire should also be credited with higher historic emissions because of the emissions in the countries that they were controlling. And then we can move to a few of the others. I'm just going to run through them very quickly. You can look at them later. The main companies responsible, one is the aspiring BRICS or the invited BRICS, Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco. And then you've got the big majors, ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Chevron. And then we move to a BRICS member, the UAE, it's Abu Dhabi, then Peabody. And then you can go down the list and see the different oil companies whose Scope 3 emissions who are responsible for the climate catastrophe. Now, I'm just going to now move to my alternative to what I think those three core ideas of the BRICS and the G7. So just to recall, number one, don't cut emissions and don't leave your fossil fuels underground. And number two, don't admit that you emitted. Never acknowledge a liability. Don't pay reparations. Don't be charged with climate debt. Now, that's harder for them as of a couple of weeks ago, because, as you know, in the International Court of Justice, there was a ruling from the ICJ judges that conceptually reparations are indeed something we can be developing within international law. We hope that's going to move some governments away from that second position, but basically all governments signed on to that second agreement. That is, no liability for past emissions. You have no climate debt. You don't owe anything, which is, as I say, G7 plus BRICS at the core of that, because they're the main emitters. And those governments that signed the Paris Climate Agreement, unfortunately, signed an annexure that says no liability. Hopefully, this new court judgment will start to maneuver that so that governments can say, like Vanuatu, the island, you do owe. So the first of our points is, and the third of the 3 points, that is, don't cut greenhouse gases, don't acknowledge a climate debt denialism, and thirdly, privatize the air. So I'll come back to that at the end of this 6 core responses from our CJ movement, which I've been involved in for 25 years, probably as much as anyone in the House. I'm sure there's some great folk here who've been even earlier involved. But as I say, in our Durban Group for Climate Justice in 2004, we began to set out some of these ideological and programmatic positions. So bear with me as I go through 6 of them as fast as I can, because you'll have the slides to check me. The first, cut the gases. Second, graceful transition. Third, redress social injustices as we address climate. Fourth, manage green technology as a global public good. Fifth, leave fossil fuels underground. And sixth, finance the climate transition gracefully. Okay, so the first is to have ambitious and binding requirements to keep the temperatures below 1.5. Some scientists say it's too late. Make sure the cuts are fairly distributed with what I've already shown you as those historic emissions in mind, so that those who've not emitted can get a chance to use up the remaining greenhouse gas emissions that we have left, instead of it just being used by the existing emitters. And then accountability mechanisms with penalties, maybe a court. We need to begin to rapidly incorporate military and maritime and air transport. And unfortunately, in Johannesburg, we set a really terrible precedent in the Rio +10 meeting, the United Nations, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which was in 2002 here in Joburg. And basically, they just ignored emissions because our host government, South Africa, under then President Thabo Mbeki, ignored climate catastrophe. And Mbeki allowed corporate thinking. And there are two crucial parts of the corporate agenda, which are technological fixes, which are often false solutions, I'll come back to, and also to have a sort of market strategy. And that's what they've renamed sustainable development. Our forces typically are broken in these as well. So we have often conservationists who sometimes are, as you see, a kind of conservative and white to save the environment. And then you have the economic justice, and we haven't figured a way to get climate justice really established. We began this process, and we at one point had a climate justice now in the UNFCCC contesting climate action network. And so we felt at that point, about 15 years ago, really around the time of the Copenhagen Accord, which was a terrible defeat, we could have moved our global agenda further. But business and government have been able to divide and conquer. And especially you see that in the UN, where the corporates have way too much say. Didn't I tell you Zapiro is the greatest cartoonist in the world, right? Now, here's the crucial moment where the imperialist West, represented by Barack Obama, he barges in. He just won the Nobel Peace Prize the day before. And he's out of power in 2017. On our side, from South Africa, you see Jacob Zuma out of power in 2018. We saw Lula da Silva. He lost power in 2010, or 2 terms in a row, gave it to Dilma Rousseff, and now is in power again. Wen Jiabao and Manmohan Singh. And as you see in that chart below, these are 5 of the most important emitters in history, right? And so they needed to get together, and Obama barged into this meeting room and cut the deal, the Copenhagen Accord. And there was an African who I want you all to know this name, Lumumba Diaping, because he was leading the G77 plus China. He's sitting next to Mitika Mwenda from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And as he said, many African negotiating delegations were unprepared. Some members were lazy or had been bought off by the industrialized nations. He specifically, Paksha specifically named Meles Zenawi, who was basically the lead African, who went to Paris with a climate debt demand and came out after meeting Nicolas Sarkozy with half of it. But the crucial problem, he singled out South Africa, saying that some members of the delegation actively sought to disrupt the unity of the bloc. Absolutely true. South Africans who work in the UNFCCC are often allied with the West. So as Martha Bekele and I described in an article that I'll send around as soon as I finish, we found that last year when there was a walkout led by Malawians, and all the poorest countries in Africa and around the world, the LDCs and the small island states walked out. But who didn't walk out? The head of the AU, who was advised by a white South African, and a white South African who was the environment minister, is also the co-chair of the mitigation committee in the UNFCCC. So we've got a really big problem that we have here to deal with, which is our white guys that go to the UNFCCC are absolutely appalling. And that was the case also in 2009, when the particular people who harassed Lumumba Diaping themselves now have very, very important positions in the Presidential Climate Commission. Okay, those details we can deal with if you want. But we then hosted the UNFCCC, the COP17, the Conference of Polluters 17 in Durban, and that's more or less the scene, right? That the climate justice movement was getting up and running with about 10,000 protesters. And then in 2015, you really got a sense that the crucial aspects for imperialism and sub-imperialism, in other words, the big G7 and the sort of emerging BRICS, were to have voluntary, no accountability, ability, sort of, they have this phrase bottom up, no liability for climate debt. Okay, the second, and I'll go through this much more quickly because I think it's important that we get to what's going to happen in the G20, which is mostly a climate finance debate. So I'll give you a quick overview of that in just a second. But just transitions are so important, especially led by workers and communities where the decarbonization process will be economically difficult. And it shouldn't just be in energy, but transport, tourism, agriculture, and urban production systems, consumption, and all the rest. Now, to get a JET-P, a Just Energy Transition Partnership, South Africa set the pilot for that in 2021 when at the Glasgow COP, the first deals were announced. And then at Sharm el-Sheikh in 2022, the deals came through with money, and a lot of money, $8.5 billion to persuade South Africa and its president, as you see, Cyril Ramaphosa, to become the first of the governments, followed by Senegal, by Indonesia. There are a few others, but basically to try to get South Africa to close down our coal-fired power stations. 85% of the power in this laptop I'm talking to you through is from coal-fired power stations. And so we're basically doing 40% of Africa's output, having just only 5% of Africa's population. And it's for basically the largest companies, 27 companies, who are called the Energy Intensive Users Group. They use 42% of the electricity, and they produce only 4% of the country's jobs. And that's BHP Billiton is the worst, Sasol, ArcelorMittal, Mercedes, BMW, all of the big industries are chewing up our electricity, and they're very capital intensive. And so that's a very interesting debate that the Europeans have begun, because on January 1, their exports of those 27 companies to Europe are going to be taxed. There's going to be a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I'll come back to that quickly. And to give you a sense of what a farce our JET-P was, 44% of the investments are going to be going to methane gas. And our trade minister, Parks Tao, has been going to the US and asking Donald Trump to sell $12 billion worth of methane gas so that we can go from a coal addiction, which I have for my laptop. I also have solar, but we're terrible with coal. But it'll be worse because it'll be a meth addiction. And some of you know what meth addictions, they're hard to get off. So we're investing vast amounts in this stranded assets for new LNG plants are being planned, huge new pipelines. So we're trying to stop them each step of the way. And one of the ways to stop is to say, don't give South Africa JET-P money because it's farcical. And that's the position of our climate justice charter movement. And the unions hate what's happened so far. The one coal-fired power station called Komati that did close, there's no consultation with the workers or communities. And we also do have a bottom-up strategy introduced first in 2009 called 1 million climate jobs for the just transition. Okay, lots of other things to talk about on the CJ agenda, so I'll be very fast. Racial justice, indigenous people's rights, global south, feminist youth communities, civil and political rights, links between human rights and climate justice, the rights of nature, which are in 2 constitutions in Ecuador and Bolivia, the rights of climate migrants and refugees, and for the youth, the rights of your generation and future generations. And this is, after all, the very definition, isn't it, of sustainable development. And Gro Harlem Brundtland and a Zimbabwean, Bernard Chidzero, who's the finance minister, came up with this framing in 1987 about sustainability being about the intergenerational justice, because our children inherit the losses. We borrow environmental capital from future generations, right, with our emissions and pollution, depletion of resources, with no intention or prospect of repaying. So that's what a sort of honest statement of injustice, generational injustice. A fourth area, as I said, is the tech fix. Again, too much to go into in the detail that would be ideal, but you hear a lot about climate-friendly technologies, localized production, intellectual property being removed from these things. That's all definitely necessary, but watch out for net zero scamming, tech fix false solutions, geoengineering fantasies, abated coal, carbon capture and storage, timber plantation, sequestration of CO2, genetic modification, nuclear energy, right? And so all of these techniques of geoengineering, we're seeing early versions of, none of them are working. I mean, we of course worry about nuclear because that does work, but it has huge dangers on the side. Okay, the next is the 5th point: leave fossil fuels underground, seize new exploration and most current extraction, and revalue unburnable carbon for the oil and gas and coal companies, and pay the poorest countries to leave their oil in the soil and their coal in the hole. And that brings us to the last point in the CJ run, and then I'll conclude with some activism. financing planetary and social survival. So here it gets very detailed, very technical. Some of you know the technical work in climate financing, but I do want to just make sure, if you don't know it, you're at least aware that there's a lot of emphasis on the G20 meeting here in Johannesburg on coming up with solutions to two related problems: the climate financing gaps and the African external debt, which is in some cases cannot be repaid. Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia have gone bankrupt, and others may well. We usually talk about the climate debt that the North owes the South, and I'm here in the North myself, and I have a huge climate debt from flying around in airplanes. But not making it personal, the West are those who benefited, but also BRICS, which benefited from huge emissions, should pay three kinds of damages. First, loss and damage for the actual expenses that go with cleaning up after extreme weather. Second, we have adaptation costs to climate-proof cities, to put stormwater drainage and more effective bridges and road systems and better housing. And in the rural areas, better irrigation systems. And the third is to compensate for the low emissions countries not using the atmospheric space. So they should be compensated, or we should be paid, some would say, for leaving coal in the hole, or in the maybe most obvious case next door to us in Mozambique, leaving that Cabo Delgado methane gas under in the Rovuma Basin. Now, this is very important because Ramaphosa has been saying we need to have more cooperation on debt relief and climate finance in the global community, including international financial institutions, development banks, and the private sector. So he's really has emphasized this as the number one objective of his hosting of the G20 here, November 22nd and 23rd, and some of the preliminary meetings. Okay, now I'm unmuted. For Ramaphosa, everything is going wrong because in the debt service suspension initiative, which was the sort of delay on poor countries' debt that the G20 agreed on, we haven't seen any improvement after that has ended. And the main problem is for African countries, their revenues from international sales of cash crops, but especially minerals, with the exception of gold, right? South Africa sits, we used to sit on half the world's gold underneath me. We still have some. But aside from gold, all the other commodity prices have crashed since the high point in May 2022, after that sort of COVID bump in the prices. And then came another problem. The US Federal Reserve sets the world's interest rate, which affects how much we can repay for our debt. And that went through the roof starting in early 2022. And then we've had these situations. My friend Len in Kenya will tell you all about the loss and damage that he and his fellow Nairobi and Kenyan residents suffered from flooding in early 2024, from the droughts, from the locusts in 21-22, and those excess costs, the climate loss and damage, then were reflected in the fiscal policies to tax Kenyans. And then, of course, we had Len and his mates in Gen Z. They showed us, and they made the demand for odious debt to be audited. Another major problem is that Donald Trump hates DEI, diversity, inclusion, and equity, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. In other words, environmental and social and governance commitments that banks made. So they've just basically this year in January, when he was coming to power, they just cut it. And then we've had all the aid cutbacks. So US aid chopped and climate finance withdrawn. And it's not just Elon Musk, our homeboy here, but UK and EU governments who are also pulling back as they remilitarize. Now, the man in charge of this whole effort to deal with the African debt is named Trevor Manuel. He's the deputy chair of Rothschilds. He's the chair of Old Mutual. They have major portfolio investments in African debt. It's not in their interest to cancel debt or to do odious debt. And this guy, Trevor Manuel, who was our finance minister, who brought neoliberalism in from 1996 to 2009 when he left the finance ministry, he was even promoted as the logical leader of the International Monetary Fund after the then managing director, whose name was Dominic Strauss-Kahn, raped a woman from Guinea in a New York hotel. Well, he didn't get the job. Another corrupt French a woman called Christine Lagarde, literally being prosecuted for corruption, but still given the head of the IMF. And she was successfully prosecuted, and she still kept that job. Now she's head of the European Central Bank. That's how sleazy these guys are, right? Strauss-Kahn. And Manuel said in 2009, as the head of the IMF committee, and the G20 figures right now coming in, they're wanting to empower the IMF. So the IMF got huge, up to $1 trillion more. And so the 2010s were a period of very arrogant African finance ministers going to the euro markets to borrow, and then they couldn't repay. But also the IMF just basically kept going, although they did adopt a little bit more climate consciousness. But you can see, if you scan the world, terrible debt crises everywhere. And that's because of these sustained high interest rates. Now, the next part of the story is about some of the financial gimmicks. And one of them, which I hope can be improved, is the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism. As I said, if I have a lot of carbon in my exports from South Africa, which I do because of the coal-fired power plants, that embedded CO2 is now going to be taxed much higher. And I'll show you why this is important when it comes to the numbers. And the G20 has a split because the BRICS don't like this. But there is a logic to the EU. So I'm a supporter of CBAM. I just think it should be improved because I count methane gas and nuclear energy as green. So they're just not on top of this. And then there's absolute chaos in the way you look at the pricing, the taxation, and the carbon markets. And then there's utter chaos in the way in which the carbon market's been operating. You can see from 2023 to 2024, a 50% crash. You can see it just zigzagging all over the place. This is a profound casino, right? This whole carbon market, the emissions trading scheme. And as I say, it's very uneven, where South Africa only has a 40 US cents per ton carbon tax. Sweden's is $132 a ton. And that's why South Africa is really going to be nailed when it goes into the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And then we have lots of other things that we could talk about. The people that really need to be paid, the climate debt, and the people who need to be paid, including me and South Africans, the wealthier and paler skinned South Africans are not paying. How much should we pay? What should be the price if I fly to Europe and back? That's a ton of carbon. What should I be paying? So there is a big debate. The IMF says it should be $60, but the World Economic Forum even admitted last year it could be $1,056. And the people who did that study, whose names are Adrian Bilal and Diego Kenzig, where they're from major universities in the US, Stanford and Northwestern, they actually did a subsequent paper in November last year that says it should be $1,500 per metric ton. That's a serious, what we would call a social cost of carbon. That's what the tax on my ticket, if I fly back and forth to Europe, should be extra beyond the price of the ticket. But we have friends at the University College London who say, actually, it should be $3,000 a ton because you have to do feedback effects. So let's just put it this way. When South Africa says 40 US cents a ton, and top economists in the US are saying $1,500 a ton, well, there's a huge difference. Anyway, a climate debt is owed, as I said, loss and damage. Number two, we need to spend money on climate proofing. And number three, we need to pay poor countries for their unutilized CO2 emission space. And the people like myself who have excess emissions should be cutting back even faster. This is not too radical because even the South African government won position as they committed to in the UNFCCC to have money paid to South Africa by the International Climate and Development Finance Community for non-fossil fuel development in Mpumalanga. That's where most of the coal has come from. So you see, even South Africa, with our reactionary, fossil-addicted ruling class, is actually saying, if we leave the coal in the hole, pay us. And that, to me, is the right way to go for many countries, even though I don't think South Africa deserves it. So we should be doing that all over, in places especially like Mozambique. Leave fossil fuels unexploited because it's expensive if you put on the proper carbon tax of $1,500 a ton. That would keep the fossil fuels underground. But let me ask you one other thing. What about ordinary people who are affected? How should we pay them? I'm not too sure, but I think I like this basic income grant as a model. It comes from a place, Otjivera, Namibia, and some Germans with a conscience, yeah, there are some, very few, you know, they're not doing very well. But anyway, Germans with a conscience in the Evangelical Lutheran Church, along with some IG Metall, some trade unions members, said, yeah, we should be paying Namibians. We did genocide the Herero and the Nama people. So they had actually a very good pilot in Otjivero, a little town about an hour and a half to the east of Windhoek. And they gave everybody in the town 100 Namibian dollars, which was about 10 euros. And look at these incredible effects, poverty rates declining. So I think if you live in an area that's been climate affected, you should be able to go to the people who did the damage, like me and Germans and the Yankees and all, say, hey, you owe us, and we could deal with this easily without any administrative headache if you give everybody a monthly $10 or $50, whatever we think is going to help to restore them after a climate emergency of the sort that we've seen are so devastating, droughts and floods and extreme weather events. The final couple of slides are just to remind you, we're not going to get anywhere inside if we don't have outsiders. The insiders, let me call them jam makers. They need tree shakers outside, people who shake the tree and get the nice fruit, not overripe and not underripe. They need the proper fruit to make a good jam. And I think it's this combination of insiders and outsiders. This is a good example. It's Standard Bank. It's the main sub-imperialist financial fossil financier in Africa. And you can see we protest them so much they've had to put up a big fence against us, and we're going to go back there as an EACOP protest, East African Crude Oil Pipeline, on August 19. If you're anywhere near Joburg, this is the place to be that day. And then I want to just mention a final point, which is that the coal exporters from South Africa are sending coal to Israel to fuel the genocide. So we're protesting. In this case, this is Glencore, but another company run by the president's brother-in-law. His name, Patrice Motsepe. And you may know of him if you like soccer, because he runs the Confederation of African Football, and he won't kick Israel off FIFA, right, which is another campaign. But to stop the coal, which is 1.6 million tons of coal leaving Richards Bay, our main coal port, going to Israel to fuel the IDF's mass murder of the people in Gaza. And our protest now isn't just at the companies. We're going to the South African government, which talks left in Hague. That is, they go to the International Court of Justice and say it's genocide, but they walk right. The secret slogan is Hague Schmeig. Who cares what they say in The Hague and even in the Hague group? So this is what we'll be doing on August 21. Do come and join us for these. A very last slide with my conclusions, if I still have another 20 seconds. We need to have much, much more voice behind ecological reparations, a climate debt, because in the G20, it is not going to come up. And I must confess that most of my friends who do this work here in Johannesburg are despairing because the technocrats in the G20, they don't want to hear about climate debt. And you can imagine why. It'll go nowhere in the G20 elites, the combination of the G7 and the BRICS, the imperialists and sub-imperialists. Another problem is that when you do get some reparations through a loss and damage fund, it's not reparations, but it's money. And yeah, the damn World Bank is dishing it out. So it's going to go in the same way our Just Energy Transition Partnership has gone absolutely awful in terms of its distribution. The international consultancies, did I say consultancy? Yeah, I always get that wrong. These consultancies get all the money. And so that's what we're learning in the JETP as well. Challenging the elite legitimacy. We've had two fantastic African leaders, Malawi's Evans Njewa last year in Baku, and South Sudan's Lumumba Diaping in Copenhagen. And the tree shaking outside can generate the kinds of fruits that will get us the jam. That's our theory of change. Have we ever had that theory work? Yes. At the World Trade Organization, a nasty, nasty institution, in 2001, there was so much tree shaking outside for AIDS medicines to be taken off of intellectual property. And the activists and a few good insiders in World Health Organization, UNAIDS, they were able to make a clear case, and African governments came around finally, not South Africans, but the others, and said, we need free, when we need generically produced AIDS medicines, and we need to give it out through our governments. We need support. Now, Donald Trump and Elon Musk just killed PEPFAR. They're reviving a small part of it right now, but basically PEPFAR was the way the US did. But there's even better, a United Nations fund, a global fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria. I think that's what we need. But I'm very curious to hear what all of you would say, because I've run through very quickly, too many slides, just to give you a sense of the very frustrating situation we face here in Johannesburg, where we have 5 different climate justice movements. They're fragmented, and turf wars, and personalities. We have an elite that's absolutely fossil addicted, that sends coal to Israel to kill Palestinians. That's how awful our ruling class here is in Johannesburg. So we need you to come and help. If you can't come in November, that's okay. We had some meetings this morning. We're just putting together wonderful events, so you can keep in touch with me if you want the news of what we'll be planning. But in your hometown, in your capital cities across Africa, get out there and make some heat, because you have every right to be here in Johannesburg as a member of the G20, since the AU is a member. But of course, you won't be listened to. You'll have to make yourself very loud, and we'll do everything we can to amplify what you have to say. Thanks, dear friends, dear comrades.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. That has been so enlightening. Before I give the podium to proceed with the questions, perhaps I should pause for you one. Now, the G20 leaves developing countries aside. How does this selective membership affect the legitimacy and the fairness of the decision? I'm going to ask you 3. I don't know whether you'll note them down. I expect you maybe to respond after. Then number 2.
Would we be able to take a few questions, Len? Is that possible? And then we'll have everyone feeling like they have every ability to input and give their points of view. I'd love that.
Yeah, I stand guided.
Can we do that with everybody else? Or do you want to take them 3 at a time, Len? Or how do you like to do it normally? What's your best?
I thought maybe everyone will pose their questions, can pen them down, then you answer them at once.
So one of the problems, Len, is your microphone doesn't come to me very well. I don't know if it comes to others. Maybe Martha was hearing, maybe if Martha's...
Yeah, I agree.
Is that right?
Len, if you can get closer to your mic and speak a little bit louder. Usually I hear you real well, but right now not so well.
Okay, sure. Maybe someone else can proceed while I work on my microphone. The floor is open. I've seen Martha. Martha, you can proceed with your question.
So much. Thank you so much. It's always a delight listening to you, Prof. I was just commenting, when you look at the data in 2022, for instance, I was just commenting, 57% of African LDCs were borrowing for climate adaptation. LDCs and adaptation, mind you. Of course, you are told these are concessional loans, maybe the interest rate is 0 and the repayment period is longer, but at the end of the day, it is adding on your debt. You touched on the diplomacy and how we have this, what you always say, the self-imposed censorship on our diplomacy and agency is another thing. So my question, maybe a reflection is, I wanted to ask you if these reform talks are a distraction, a total distraction, because how do you reform a system that is based on zero-sum game? And, is it compatible to begin with? Is it compatible to justice, for instance? Why are we spending time on reform when maybe what we need to push for is a rupture? I don't know, or yeah, you would have an answer to it.
Good. What a great question. I hope everybody answers that question. Who's next? It's Kevin, you're next.
Yes, Professor. Good evening, everyone. Good evening.
We can hear.
Kevin,
Yeah,
proceed.
can you hear me? Can you hear me, Professor Patrick?
I can.
Thank you. I'm happy to be in this meeting. I can say the presentation is quite very fantastic, and I really like that. So the question that I'm asking is that as the the advocates for the climate justice, we are really pushing for the government to implement some of the reforms that we are really advocating for. But now,
Can you say where you're from, Kevin? And maybe everyone can. I know Martha so well, but she's working at an NGO in Nairobi and a PhD student of ours. What's your background before you make your question clear? Just so I know which country you're coming from and which organization.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Patrick. Thank you. I'm Kevin. I come from Kenya. I'm from Kenya, and I'm very delightful with some of the agenda that we are really pushing on matters of climate change. So my question is that the advocacy is very okay, and now we know very well that it is the government that is really contributing immensely to the matters of climate change. So I was asking a question that to what extent or which measures we have that you put in place to ensure that the government actually can really give the compensation on matters of climate justice. That is my question number one. Thank you.
Good. Do we have somebody else? And maybe Len, if your mic is working, you could also come back and also rephrase your question. I didn't quite get it. The voice didn't reach me.
Yeah, thank you, Prof, for allowing me to come back again. I hope I'm audible enough this time.
Yeah, definitely. Great.
Yeah, so mine is just simple. I had three, but in the interest of time, I'll give other participants also to ask questions. Mine is number one. G20, we are all familiar about the G20, especially during 2010. It was so active. 2010, it was held in South Africa. My question in relation to that, the G20 leaves developing countries outside. It slides the developing countries. So my question in regards to that is, how does this selective membership affect the legitimacy and fairness of their decision? I don't know if I can proceed to two so that you can answer them at once.
Yeah, go for a second one. I'm on top of it all. Yeah.
Then the G20 lacks enforcement mechanism as well. How can the G20 move from being a talk shop to a platform that drives measurable action?
Great. Well, the G20 is more than a talk shop when it needs to be. So let me start with that and then come back to Martha, who's asking the other tough question, which we could call fix it or nix it. As you know, the G20 has had this crucial moment initially in 1999 when they started, because there was an emerging markets crisis. So they met in Montreal as finance ministers. But then came the biggest financial crisis since 1929. That was in 2008. And in September, the biggest New York, one of the biggest investment banks, Lehman Brothers, went bankrupt. And very quickly, the G20 wasn't just finance ministers. George W. Bush brought the heads of state to Washington in October. And they gave Trevor Manuel this job of saying, hey, beef up the IMF. But they also all agreed that they would reflate. In other words, they'd put more money into the world economy. And they did that again in 2020. So it's probably accurate to say it's a talk shop on matters of importance to the 99%. But they actually do deliver huge amounts of money for the 1%. And the 1% gets money because quantitative easing is the main solution capitalism has to its problems like a financial collapse. They just print money. I couldn't believe it because I used to work in the Federal Reserve and that was just not done, but they were so shaky. They all agreed in 2007, 8, 9, 10 to have much more relaxed credit standards and to print money. So actually, Len, the G20 has been crucial to allowing global capitalist financial coordination for bailing out themselves. But the effect of that was to make the very rich much richer because a lot of that money didn't get reinvested in goods and services and production and machinery and plant and equipment. It didn't get invested properly. It certainly wasn't invested in in climate and green energy investments. Instead, it went into Wall Street, and it went into the various financial instruments and real estate that made the richest even richer, far richer than ever in world history. So that's the problem with the way the G20, I would say, it doesn't deserve to continue because of that history, right, of financial machinations to help big banks in the West and a few in other countries, and especially help the rich. So to me, the G20 is a pack of imperialist and sub-imperialist thieves, and everything they're doing, even though they use three words as the main themes here, which are solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And in saying those three words are themes, G20 hosting here, Marco Rubio, the US foreign minister, said, that sounds like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and climate. I'm not coming. So he and Scott Bessent, the other crucial US minister, the finance minister, treasury secretary, have refused to come to the meetings here in South Africa. And so what we're looking at is a complete breakdown of anything in the G20 land, which brings me to, I think, where Martha is asking, oh, by the way, I mean, I could go on for hours about the crazy things we've been doing. We've been accused of white genocide. I can assure you, you're worried about me because I have white skin, right? Don't be worried. White people in South Africa are not facing a genocide. And there was this nonsense film that Trump showed on May 21 in the Oval Office, and Cyril Ramaphosa and these white golfers, everyone was a bit embarrassed. It was just silliness. But Trump says, I'm not going to come to Johannesburg, and I'm going to have the G20 next year in Mar-a-Lago, right? That's his home. So extreme conflicts of interest, right? And so our objective is partly, I mean, mine at least, 20, vote Trump off the island, kick the US out, let the Mexicans host the G20 next year. Now, of course, the power relations today are adverse, but Trump does so many crazy things every week, something new and ridiculous. So I think that's actually a really interesting question. Should the G20 continue? And shouldn't it be the G19? Maybe Claudia Sheinbaum, a genuine social democrat in Mexico, she should host it, and no more US, at least for the next 4 years. So many reasons why, if you like, we can get into them, not just walking out of the UNFCCC and doing more climate damage, which means I think this UNFCCC, Martha, you're asking a very good question. You know, the phrasing of that question, we started asking at the World Trade Organization in Seattle in 1999. And we asked it at the World Bank in April 2000. And we've asked it again and again at these big meetings. At those two meetings, the first two, it was serious. And the reasons were that our team in Seattle, which people came from all over the world, 70,000 strong, they shut down the WTO. They just blocked it. So the question is posed like this: fix it or nix it? In other words, can you repair it? If you can't repair it, well, shut it down. And look, you obviously can't repair it. Your reforms are not working. So fix it or nix it. For the World Bank, an even more creative approach, which everybody could get involved in, not just those who came to Washington, like my colleague Trevor Ngwani. There's a great film, Two Trevors Go to Washington, Trevor Manuel, the guy I showed you, the finance minister at the time, and the chair of the World Bank in 2000, and Trevor Ngwani, our leading activist from Soweto, and they fought it out in the streets of Washington, April 16. It's a great little video that you'll see, if you like, on YouTube. Two Trevors Go to Washington. So our strategy then was to defund the World Bank the way we defunded apartheid, which was sanctions, boycott, divestment, sanctions, the same strategy being used against fossil fuel companies by 350.org and Divest Invest, and against Israel. So these are really interesting and important ways to weaken your enemy. And in this city, exactly 40 years ago today, right, in the middle of August, the city broke down financially because we put enough pressure on banks in US cities. I was doing my studies in Philadelphia and Baltimore, but all over the US, we were protesting banks lending to apartheid. So that, to me, Martha, if you're interested in the power relations and the pressure, is one of our most creative ways of nonviolent civil disobedience and boycott, divestment, sanctions that help to bring down the apartheid system. Is a crucial part of bringing down the white bloc of big business and big government, because what sanctions did, it just got in there and broke them up, right? And took white business here in Joburg and got them angry at the white politicians. And then they visited Zambia, and they started doing deals with the ANC, and eventually we got to one person, one vote democracy. Then the next question is, can we do that with the UNFCCC? See, the difficult thing is we need a UNFCCC, don't we? We need something in the UN that can deal with climate. We need it for pandemics, so we need a strong WHO. We need it for UNESCO. We need to protect societal culture, especially the global South culture with funding. We need all these things, and we've only got that UN Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria as a great example. We have one other example that shows that you can work this system if you're strong and if the crisis is bad enough. Do you know that example? It's like CO2 emissions, but it was chlorofluorocarbon, CFC emissions. Do you remember when, okay, guys, like Rolfie and me, we can remember, we would, under our arms, spray deodorants, right? And that causes CFCs, which opened up the ozone hole. So you needed to ban those, not to have a carbon trading or emissions trading, but to ban them. So the CFC ban, which was in the Montreal Protocol of 1987, it took effect in 1996, has solved that problem. So we do have that, say, two examples, getting AIDS medicines for free. And I'm not sure statistics in Kenya or Ethiopia or other countries people are tuning in from, but in South Africa, our life expectancy went from 52, 2004 to 65 because of activists in the Treatment Action Campaign winning that demand. So we will see at some point, Martha, the balance of forces change. And maybe the final question comes from Kevin, and it's about whether part of that change will be about climate debt as something you can acknowledge. And maybe the International Court of Justice statement, which was in July 17, I think it was. Please look it up. You won't feel it gives you everything you want from the International Court of Justice. I have to tell you, there's a Ugandan deputy chair of that court. Well, I don't know how much time have I got. She's not our friend. But the rest of the court said, yes, there is a climate debt. The people who are doing CO2 emissions owe those who are damaged. There's a polluter pays. Now, they did it in a way, they couched their words. They did it in a sleazy way, in my view, but they did it. And I think we have to now start saying to our emitters, and we have to go into our environmental impact assessment statements when there's a CO2 intensive project, and we have to go to our own judges and say, you see, the top judges in the world admit that if you emit, you owe. And that we're trying. And you watch this space on September 16, right? Just about a month from now, we'll have the major case here in South Africa over offshore drilling by Shell and a local ally, Johnny Copeland. We're going to really have a very interesting debate, I think, over exactly this question of whether there is going to be a liability for pollution. Because I think, Kevin, if you look at your own environmental management legislation, maybe you know it inside and out, because you're a good activist with technical capacities as well as militancy, you will know it says polluters pay. Pretty much every country has a provision in environmental management that says polluters pay, except for climate. So that's what we have to get through. I hope that answers the three of you. And it looks like Jackson Kisangani, also from Kenya. Are you going to come in? Jackson, do you want to speak? Or Len, you've got your voice back. You take over the chairing, please.
Jackson.
Yeah.
Jackson, you can address.
Okay.
Can address us now. Can address Prof.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know whether you hear me.
Just speak up a little bit more, please, Jackson. The line to Nairobi is too far.
Hello.
Too quiet.
Yeah, my name is Jackson Kisangani. I am a private contributor activist for peace and climate justice from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So thank you, Professor Bond, for such a powerful and insightful presentation on climate justice. You highlighted the importance of addressing the climate debt through loss and damage reparations. In a context like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where our emissions are minimal, but our vulnerabilities are immense, what concrete strategies can global South countries used to push major emitters from promises to real action. Thank you.
Fantastic. Jackson from DRC, are you in Kinshasa or on the east side? Or where are you from, Jackson? Do you have an organization in the DRC we should know?
Yeah, I'm coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo. As I said, I'm an activist for peace and climate justice from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Congo Kinshasa, yeah.
From Kinshasa, but are you working in the capital city? Because it's the east side where this is so important, because Donald Trump was given an invitation by Tshisekedi to come and find $4 trillion worth of minerals. But you know, under Lake Albert and also in the Virunga Park, there's oil. How much? 10, 15, 20 billion dollars worth? How can we help your team make the case there should be no drilling under Lake Albert? We've been trying with EACOP, right? The other side of Lake Albert, the Uganda side. And the Total plus China National Overseas Oil Corporation, financed by Standard Bank. So we're protesting all the time, but we don't know enough. All I know is that my tax money went to send my South African National Defense Force Army to Eastern DRC. And they lost about 25 troops, mostly in January, but over the prior year. Probably, Jackson, you can remember, right? The South Africans came. And you might be asking, why are South African troops there? And the Mozambicans might be asking, why are there South African troops defending Total in northern Mozambique to get the gas from Cabo Delgado against the insurgents in northern Mozambique who are called Al-Shabaab, or in Eastern DRC, M23. And the biggest dilemma, right, is that Eastern DRC is $24 trillion worth of minerals and oil, and you know, it's an incredibly valuable place. It's the most resource cursed place. Often, Jackson, you come to Joburg and I'll show you around. We think we're the most resource cursed because we had half the world's gold underneath me in Johannesburg, half the world's historic gold. And we frittered it away, and the white people took it all to London and New York and Toronto and Melbourne. So we've really lost a huge wealth. And I'm in the Bohemian suburb next to the universities, and often at night, my water doesn't work because the city is so poor. It hasn't fixed the pipes, hasn't hired the people just to fix the pipes. So at night, they turn the reservoirs off, otherwise all the water would go out, you know, through the leaks. So that's the resource cursing that you suffer, that we are the probably the worst case in Africa historically in terms of the money. So what can we do? Let's make some anti-imperial and anti-sub-imperial politics so that we know if South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, is dealing with Paul Kagame, hey, there's trouble. It's going to be trouble. And if Donald Trump comes into the mix, oh, it's going to be horrible. Maybe Rolfie, who knows the US side, will help us to find ways to weaken those processes of resource looting and militarization. The South African troops don't fight very well. Otherwise, I'd be very, very worried of sub-imperial military power. They don't know how to fight. So they lost right away. And they've basically been repatriated along with the rest of the Southern Africa Development Community, SADC mission, SANM, Southern African, oh, that was the Mozambican one. So our troops are losing, but the troops that I'm worried about most, the next sub-imperial army is in Kigali, right? The Rwandans, and they want Eastern DRC. So your work for peace and justice against the resource cursing and bringing climate gives you an additional advantage, I think. I don't know if others agree, Jackson, but we have to pay the people of the Eastern DRC to leave the fossil fuels and not wreck Virunga. I mean, that's the most precious park I can think of, and not drill under Lake Albert. And maybe there are plenty of other parts of the DRC where you're worried. So you have to tell us more, because we don't have ways that all the Congolese who live in Johannesburg are listening to you and telling us, because I haven't really heard the marching orders we should be getting from your side. Will you stay in touch with me? I hope you will, because my French is in merde. So if you're speaking English as well as you are, I will be desperate to learn what you suggest that we read. I'm putting my email, and that invitation is for everyone. Len, it's over to you, or Rolfie, you coming in.
Yes.
Yeah, if I could just make a real quick comment that Jackson is going to be one of the main speakers coming on August 29th and 27th, and he'll be relating the struggles in the Congo. And those friends of yours in South Africa are obviously invited to come and listen on Zoom like this one. And then I'm wondering if I might have a simple question for you. You gave a breakdown of, let's say, 6 groups. And some of them are obvious allies to us, Social Democrat or the Solidarity Group or the core. But of those 4 groups up above, I was thinking, obviously the paleo conservatives are quite a mess. But if you look at the BRICS group, granted, there are plenty of fossil fuel users, but there's a change going within the BRICS group, I would say, with India and China, more open and ideologically, at least ideologically, not ill-disposed to renewables. Whereas the paleo conservatives are obviously fundamentally opposed to renewables, if I oversimplify that. And can one not regard the BRICS group as a potential ally, even if there are obviously vested interests that are in favor of retaining fossil fuels?
Isn't that the greatest question every one of us must ask in our own countries? Basically, you're distinguishing between fractions of capital. There's dirty capital and there's clean capital. And the climate action strategy led by, let's say, Al Gore, conceptually and in his symbolism, climate action believes capitalism can solve the climate catastrophe if you change the incentive structure, you work markets, put on proper taxes, get new technologies. They haven't done it very well, have they? These carbon markets I showed you are ridiculous. But they can make the case, and Gore just did in Nairobi a couple of weeks ago. There's a TED talk that he did. And he is making the case that the capitalists turning to clean energy. Now there's, I'd say, 3 parts. It's wind, it's solar. The third is crucial. How do you store the energy because of the intermittency of wind and solar? Well, there are 2 ways. You dig up lots of lithium, hopefully it'll become sodium ion, or you find mountains where you have a reservoir at the top and at the bottom. In the sunny day, and when it's windy, you pump up the water, and then it comes down so that at night or when it's overcast, you've got this big battery called pumped storage. That's what South Africa is beginning to do, but we're losing. And I must say, in China and India, I think they're losing because there's more gigawatts of coal-fired power plants that I showed you on that chart coming into place in those countries that are supposedly the green champions than anywhere else. And I think really we have a dilemma that it's not going to be easy to say the BRICS as one thing because they're so different. Ethiopia is a member of the BRICS, right? But we have to begin to say there's certain kinds of capitalists that have certain kinds of power within the BRICS. And right now, if I think of the coal industry and what we call here black diamonds, it's not even the white guys in Anglo Coal. They've sold to Tungela, a black-owned company run by a Zimbabwean, July and Lovo until recently. And those guys are just as wicked as any Western, coal company that wants to keep going. So it seems to me that we are in a situation where you have to make friends, and we're, of course, would be friendly with companies that do solar and wind. But, we can't let them get too powerful. Why? We need to nationalize them. We need a national grid. Why? Because we need to redistribute. Otherwise, we've got this terrible energy apartheid where the petty bourgeoisie, right, the middle class, I've got 6 solar panels on my rooftop. I can walk outside and show you if you're curious. 6 solar panels, and I've got a good inverter and battery. But that costs me $7,000 worth, right? You can make the calculations. How many people in your country In this country, only about 2%. And they are doing it because we have such a shaky electricity system. So it's at that level, I think, where the people promoting, Rolfie, the market strategy of allowing India and China to produce cheap, to put it in cheap, but there's still too much fossil. And then when I look at those capitalists, certainly in South Africa, they're so weak. But in a way, I want them to be weak because we want to, one day we'll have a good government, we'll nationalize solar and wind and make it community co-op based, socially owned, worker controlled, community oriented, right? That's what we'd want. Our biggest problem in the poorer areas, I'm going to spend Saturday in Soweto with Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee and the comrades there. And they find that they can get affordable solar, but not enough to run a stove and a kettle. Why? Because the amperes you need go up to 20. And they're only getting about 5 amperes from about 3, maybe 4 panels. So they can't run their stoves. And that means if you do a gender analysis, oh, guess who has the cooking responsibilities? The women who then turn to the dirty energy, the coal, the wood, the paraffin, the kerosene, are getting particulate matter inside the house, in their lungs, even though they might have a strong solar system for their radio and their cell phone charging and their lights. But it's really getting the level of solar and wind to the point we can say everybody gets 20 amperes. Everybody gets a free basic electricity here. Free basic electricity is only 50 kilowatt hours per household per month. We think it should be 200, right? We're looking for 2 per person per day as our basic minimum. These are the sorts of fantastic debates that our Soweto activists are teaching us about. They've got every trick in the book. They know how to reconnect. They're like Robin Hoods, right? They're kind of, we call them commoners. They common the electricity by 86% of Soweto, the biggest township in South Africa, are illegally connected, mostly because communities and they've worked mutual aid. So they use electricity, which is coal-fired, but they're also at the vanguard of demanding the solar panels and the wind and the pumped storage. So these are the struggles, and I hope between now and November, we'll make a big dent by publicizing them through the vehicle we're using called the United Front, and it's going to be relaunched on Saturday in Soweto. If anyone in Joburg is on the line, you want to join us. But also because they've already decided they don't like the G20 and they don't like the C20, which is civil society, coming inside, being co-opted, and an S20, social 20, that Lula originated last year in November in Brazil, and they don't like that. And they're not so sure about some of the other formulations, like a T20 of think tanks, who are basically conservative, middle class, academics like myself. So now we're going to see something called break the G20. We had to break the BRICS back in 2023, 2018. So you'll see a little bit of quite cheeky commentary on the failure of the imperial plus sub-imperial climate policy and in fact, everything else coming from Joburg. Now, I don't know if we can go on another 10 minutes. I'm happy to. I don't see any other hands. What do you think? Len, you're in charge, or Rolfie?
Yeah,
the rhythm of your seminars?
Prof, we're enjoying your talk. We are all invested in what you're saying. Kindly, we have 10 minutes. You can proceed.
Sounds like
Unless
Kevin's
I've
ready
seen
to.
Kevin. Kevin has a question. Kevin, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. I think I'm asking you this question, but I don't think if maybe you are the right person to ask the question. But we have the Paris Agreement 2015 that was signed by the United Nations on United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. My question is that what are the mechanisms that the G20 is having as far as the enforcement of the Paris Agreement 2015 is concerned, to the big boys who are contributing immensely to the matters of climate change? And if I talk about the big boys, you know that in the world, So what are the mechanisms that the G20 has on matters the big boys who are contributing to the climate change as far as the Paris Agreement 2015 is concerned? Thank you.
Well, I'm hoping we'll have people who can stand up for the ideal of Paris, which is 1.5 degree maximum. We've already broken that, according to some scientists, but also the awareness of the limitations of Paris. Because who's the greatest climate scientist alive today? It might be a guy called James Hansen, right? And as the NASA director for climate, which is now, of course, being shut down, and as probably the earliest to go to the US Congress, I think it was 1988. Rolf, you may remember better. And he was the one to say, you know, we do have a massive climate catastrophe coming. Now, what did he say the day after Paris Climate Agreement, December 19, 2015? He said a simple one-word scientific analysis of what had happened. That one word from James Hansen, bullshit. He didn't like it. Why? Because it was all talk, no action. There was no accountability. It was so-called bottom-up because Barack Obama and at the time John Kerry, the Secretary of State, thought they could fiddle the language. And I hated it because it was a forgiveness of the climate debt. So I'm not going to sort of say we should defend Paris, okay, 1.5 degree, because there were so many things wrong with Paris, right? So let's ask slightly differently, if that's okay, Kevin. What would you want in a G20 statement if these were the kinds of leaders who, like in Montreal, 1987, they saw a problem, right? The problem is the ozone hole growing, and they said, okay, we put a cap on chlorofluorocarbons. If you had visionary leaders in the BRICS, Lula is as visionary as they come. Ramaphosa, I used to work for him, smartest guy I've ever worked for. So I know some of these leaders from the South. I mean, Xi is amazing. Putin, we hate him for his killing 2 million people, 1 million of his own killed or injured, plus probably a million and a half killed or injured in Ukraine. But these are impressive leaders. The Western leaders are pathetic, I think, in comparison. So, Kevin, I think my perspective, my friends here, our comrades, don't think we should give any legitimacy to the G20. We should basically call it the way I've been describing it, which is imperialist Western, sub-imperialist BRICS, working together to destroy everything for everybody else, right? If I'm wrong, please stay in touch with me. Make the arguments. I can always be persuaded, right? And you want to come back? Sure, go ahead, Kevin. It's fine. I don't think anyone else is going to interrupt.
I rest my question for now. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kevin.
Yeah.
I want to urge anyone on the platform, if you have a question, you can direct it to all of us or specifically to Prof. In the interest of time, I'll be giving
someone is raising the hand. Newta is raising his hand.
Kindly, Newton, you can proceed. The floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Patrick. My name is Wiebe Nauta from the Netherlands. We met a time ago.
Wonderful to see you.
Good to see you, and thanks for an inspiring talk and years of inspiring literature that you are producing and activism. I was struck by a term that you used in the paper with Mrs. Bekele, with Marta, and you distinguished between civil society activists, and you said there is civil society and there is uncivil society. And I was wondering whether you can say a little bit about it. I think I understand it. I think that you define civil society as possibly being co-opted, while the uncivil society stays true to its ideology. Is that correct in trying to understand that terminology?
Well, I wonder if it works in your area. It's usually it's civilized society who have the suit and tie and do advocacy and do all sorts of persuasive techniques, and it has to be done. Nobody's saying that we should leave that just to corporate advocates. The question is whether there's a tree shaker, jam maker, division of labor between those who are angry outside. And by the way, Wiebe, I would even say that the uncivil society forces, and we have plenty here, some of them are right-wing. They're xenophobes, for example. But many are uncivil and they do protesting. We have the highest protest rate in the world at different times in the 2000s because of class injustice and race injustice and gender injustice and ecological degradation. But their anger is justified. So they're uncivil. They protest partly because they're furious in their declining standards of living and the catastrophes that have hit them, and the fact that the elites give them no scope to solve their problems and have given them no resources to solve their problems. So their uncivility, I admire, because they're not just lying down and and just getting smacked and turning the other cheek. They're going to kind of stand up and say, no, we're going to protest. In fact, today, the protesters in a place called Germiston, which is about 30 kilometers east of me, they burned the Home Affairs office to the ground today because they were so angry at being evicted, about 400 people. That's the sort of militancy I think I have to respect, because that's how we got rid of apartheid. Now, the problem is, and maybe others here in the House will add more nuance, is the uncivil society. I'm just going to call them tree shakers. They're outside shaking the tree. The fruits are coming down. They're perfect. They're not too ripe, right? They're not too rotten. They're coming down. But the jam makers, the petty bourgeois, civil society, the government officials that are inside, they don't like to be close to the rabble outside. They distance themselves. They put down. They delegitimize the anger of the people. They call them, dirty or, ignorant, or they just basically disrespect. You know what a petty bourgeois, we put down people on class terms. And what we need to do is get our petty bourgeois insiders, suit and tie NGOs who are very polite. They've got good relations with some of the people in government. They supply them studies. They can talk to the media more eloquently. But we need them to give more respect to the tree shakers. Otherwise, they're not going to get the fruit. The fruit's going to be sour or rotten. And so we really need to say divisions of labor. Now, we've had that once or twice. Certainly in 2001, we had that for Treatment Action Campaign to get AIDS medicines off intellectual property. The Europeans couldn't even withstand it, although, damn it, the Germans and the Brits in 2020 to 2023 had successfully stopped us from getting COVID-19 vaccines off intellectual property, waived. They won. Boris Johnson, Angela Merkel. They killed a lot of people, those two. But in 2001, we had enough tree shaking outside and jam making inside that the division of labor created a wonderful product. And I hope people think about that. I just don't see any prospect when the elites in the G20 are so distant and they are riven with these awful ideologies like paleoconservatism and neoconservatism and neoliberalism. They are not ready to compromise. They have to get a lot weaker. We have to get much stronger. And I think I'll put my hat in with the uncivil society, because I think that's where the strength needs to be more surgical, not just burning down a Home Affairs. That's sort of silly, but actually going to where the problems are, right? Maybe others of you have had these debates in your hometowns, in your countries, in your debates within networks about how you influence the IPCC and the UNFCCC and other agencies you're talking to, and especially the AU. That is the one that we haven't really dented, and they're just full of nonsense as far as I can tell. The new commission chairs from Djibouti, he's not going to stand up in any way. And we're going to need these guys like Evans and Janji from Malawi to lead another walkout, right? To delegitimize what's happening inside. Maybe they'll do that in Belém. I'm not sure what the balance of forces there looks like. The one guy I always turn to for these insights, Lumumba Diaping, is living in exile. He's South Sudanese. He lives in the United Arab Emirates. He's absolutely extraordinary. So just look up his speeches. You'll see him talking, as I showed you, in places like Copenhagen. There's a beautiful speech he's done in London, and you'll see him online saying, here's the power relations that we see. This is how it's unjust. This is how we must change it. So Lumumba Diaping, I think our greatest African in this sphere of work.
Yeah, I think if there are no more questions, this will be it.
Yeah, we've gone 2 minutes over, so it's great. Len,
Yeah,
when are we
but
going to see you? I'll be in Addis for Paksha, their summer school, the Nairobi Summer School it's called, but it'll be in Addis just before the African Climate Summit. So maybe we'll run into you there, or all of you are welcome. We have a nice place where you can put people up on the floors and outside here in Johannesburg. It'll be wonderful to have any of you that want to come. November, basically 14 to 22nd, I think is our protest period.
I have noted that. I can't wait to see you as well, Prof. Before maybe we sum up, I have one question for you, Prof, and for everyone, but specifically for you. Inspired by our mentor, Rolf, I hope I'm audible enough.
Yep.
Yeah, inspired
Yes.
by our mentor, Rolf, he's also part of us today in this meeting, who stopped flying because he believes emissions from planes are far more damaging. I'm reflecting on the same question, Prof. If you could change one global rule to make climate action fairer, what will it be?
Well, I think the whole climate action narrative should be made climate justice. I always ask somebody who says, we want climate action. Oh, yeah? Well, what do you do with the poor? What do you do with workers in high carbon industry? What do you do about gender justice? And all the things I showed you is where we distinguish climate justice from climate action. But I think if I were to do one thing on that front, I work with a group called Stay Grounded. We're trying to stop new airports here in South Africa. And they say, we've got to stop private jets first. That's the easiest. That's the low-hanging fruit. And then we've got to end the frequent flyer programs. Now, the petty bourgeois NGO and me, petty bourgeois academics, oh, but I fly and I get points. But that's stupid, isn't it? That's so crazy that these different airlines compete. And then I might take a little longer route to get some more money. Terrible things we do for the frequent flyer. So let's ban those and let's ban private jets. And Viva, you might know your Schiphol airport has decided to ban private jets. I'm sure they'll zip around somewhere else in Holland, but at least that was a great statement from activists who would regularly go out and disrupt the airport. Am I right? Do you remember that, Viva?
To be honest, I wasn't aware. If Schiphol banned private jets, they probably only did it to expand the airport in other ways.
Yeah. Cynicism is exactly the right tool to bring to any discussion like that. So, well, I must thank you because I've had such a great time with all of you. And I hope the sense of what the G20, you won't believe all the bullshit that you're getting. There's a lot of hype. The hype about the BRICS, for example, and I've tried to show you that they are actually driving the emissions faster and they're least responsible. And although they didn't do the most historic emissions, the US did, and although they had a colonial and a per person, let's say, mitigation on this, we still have to get our South African ruling class, the 27 companies that use 42% of our coal-fired power in their different mines and smelters and high capital-intensive machinery. And I hope we'll have your solidarity. And that means being quite skeptical when you hear anyone from the South African government or business saying anything about climate, because I think we know by now they're not our friends. So, and of course, the same for the rest of the G20, and especially the paleo conservatives who are making our lives all that much harder by just doing climate denial. Anyway, we want to thank you. A last word from Len and Fridays for Future movement.
Yeah, maybe
we're also
can say one or two before we adjourn now the session.
You'd like me to say something? Okay, well, one little message before I thank you, actually. We are going to have a training after this on how to spread our petition that has been translated to Swahili. And those who want to stay on, actually, it's another channel. Just try to look it up, but you're all welcome. And we are spreading it throughout different countries in Africa, and I hope to have support on that. And for me personally, Patrick Bond's talk is so rich that I'm going to have to look at it 3 or 4 times to catch up with the message implied. It was very deep for me, and I thank you for sharing your time and your amazing ability to talk so freely and loosely without almost hesitating in one sentence about what you're talking about. I think that's really a gift. Thank you. And thank you all who are here to listen to Patrick. And just remember, this is being recorded and you can download it eventually in, I would say, about 4 or 5 days on Climate Talks for Everyone. And we will have other climate talks coming on, let's see, I got to get my dates right, on August 27th by a Professor Hans Sommer, and then also one of our participants here, Jackson, and I have difficulty in his last name. I want to say Kalasani. And you are welcome to listen. Thank you.
Well, great. While we're wrestling with African words, I have to do much better. But let me just teach you two to leave you with. There are 2 words that we end every meeting with here in South Africa. The 2 words are translated to English, power to the people. The 2 words are amandla, awetu. So I'll say amandla and you say awetu, and then we'll give whoever's watching this on YouTube the right send off. Amandla,
Away.
Away. Good.
Okay.
Thank you.
That is for future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Also unfair if I don't leave.
Walikuwepo vijana fulani South Africa.
Tuko pamoja.
Thank you.
Tuko
Bye.
pamoja.
Thank you, Len. Good going.
I think the meeting is
Yeah.
done now. Thank you. Hope to see
So-
each other.
So a little short training on how to use the petition and how to put the information into the database. You're all welcome, and it's on another channel. And I should type that into the chat box here. I gave you the link, and I will try to find quickly in about a minute the channel where you will find the Zoom channel where we will continue this. And I know Kevin had particular interest in this, so let's
Yes.
see.
Elder, I think you can just post the link.
Yeah,
So-
that's what I'm doing. I have to find the link. That's
Thank
the
you, thank you.
that's the gift of this whole thing. So that's the link to go to.
Thank you.
It's not the same link that you were on. So
Yeah, it's not the same.
Thank you all. The
Yeah,
meeting is
right.
adjourned. Thank you.
thank you all for being on too.
Thank you. God
Yeah.
bless you.
Yeah, bye.